Thanks very much, Linda. I hate to say this, but I feel sort of like I'm having my bar mitzvah talk, but 62 years too late. I want to thank my former student, Alan Turner McCarty, for very good advice and as I prepared this talk, but its remaining failings are strictly my own. I'm going to start with this question that you see in front of you, and I'm going to end with another question. In between, I hope I provide a few answers, so we'll see. Whoops, where are we pointing this? Oh, that's nice. Do we need a new battery or something? Oh, you said the other way around. Okay, this is better. Okay, so here's the agenda. What educational outcomes matter? How does the U.S. fare in international comparisons of academic achievement test scores? Why is it that the U.S. fares poorly, and is there a way forward? So I was talking at lunchtime with a colleague who said, you know, what the real failing is of the U.S. is that kids don't learn civics, they don't become decent citizens when they get out of school. I agree with that, but in my line of work, there are three basic kinds of outcomes that people look at. Academic achievement test scores, which is what I'm going to be talking about here. Educational attainment, credentials, how far you go in school before you drop out. Everybody does drop out, except for some of us academics who can claim we never did. And then grades, teachers of evaluation of importance. In terms of the labor market, some colleagues' opinions notwithstanding, I think that credentials are really what matter. In grades really matter. Alberto Poloni and I wrote a paper not too long ago in which we showed that grades were the major predictor of longevity up to the age of 70. Why? It's like the Woody Allen thing, you know, it's 80% of life is just showing up on time. And grades are, cumulative grade point averages are kind of a measure of doing the right thing at the right time and place over a period of years. But I'm going to talk about academic achievement scores because that's what seems to be the focus of most public discussion. So here's an item from a report of 1983. Many of you were around when that came out. And that began a third of a century of continuous bashing of the American primary and secondary education systems. And you can see what this report said. And it was based on a whole series of findings with respect to trends in achievement test scores. And the report was basically dead wrong. Why was it wrong? It was a case, for those of you who know something of statistics, of Simpson's paradox. It turned out that every major group was actually performing better during that period, especially in the wake of the desegregation in the American South, the end of Southern apartheid. But the composition of the groups of kids who were taking tests shifted in favor of the lower scoring groups. So the averages were going down. But this wasn't a crisis, it was a made-up crisis. And here we are again today. Here's our Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, claiming last spring, and this was covered every place, you know, well, you can see what it says. And she's also dead wrong. It isn't just Betsy DeVos. You could have found any time these results of international comparative studies of academic achievement come out, you'll see the same kind of story in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Atlantic. Everybody says the same thing, although not quite as baldly as Betsy DeVos did in this event at Brookings. So there are negative things to be said about the importance and the value of taking tests. I really wanted to include that one. So I'm going to talk about three large-scale assessment programs. These are big sample-based surveys, two of which are international, the third of which is our very own national assessment. PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, tests reading, science, and math at age 15, regardless of grade level. That's where I'm going to start. And then I'm going to supplement that with some data from TIMSS, the International Mathematics and Science Study, which assesses what kids know in science and math at grades 4 and 8. And then the National Assessment of Educational Progress will enter later on. It actually tests kids in all sorts of different subjects, but I'm going to focus on reading, science, and math in grades 4 and 8. It actually assesses kids' skills in grade 12 as well, but those test results are all highly suspect because by that time the kids know that the NAEP tests don't count. Okay, so here's what Betsy DeVos was talking about. In reading in PISA 2015, the U.S. was 24th of 70 nations, 25th in science, 40th in math. Now, this isn't so bad it can't get any worse, but it's not so great either. We're not leading the world, which is sort of what we would like to do, okay? Here's TIMSS. In 4th grade science, the U.S. is 10th of 47 nations, a smaller set of participating nations there, 11th of 37 in science, 14th of 48 in 4th grade math, and 10th of 37 in 8th grade math. Again, kind of mediocre, let's face it, okay? So why is that? Whenever the results from NAEP, the National Assessments of Educational Progress, come out, the press coverage then talks incessantly about the achievement gap. Blacks and Hispanics score well below whites and Asians. But it doesn't seem to be polite, and I'm not going to be polite, to put these two sets of facts together. So what I've done by way of real analysis is to take another look at the PISA and TIMSS results and treat each of these 4 major race ethnic groups as if they were separate nations. And here's what happens. In reading, whites are 6th, Asians 4th, and by the way, there are no significant differences between between the whites and Asians in Singapore, which is always at the top of the list, in that reading test at least. In science, the whites are 5th and Asians 9th. In math, whites are not so great, 20th and Asians 21st. But then blacks and Hispanics are well below them. So why does the U.S. overall score mediocre in these relatively badly in these tests? It's because of the composition of the population in the United States. And here's what happens, exactly the same story in TIMSS. In 4th grade science, Asians are 1st, whites 4th, and so on. You can see what the disparities are. So we score very near the top when the students are white or Asian, and middling to maybe a little bit worse if the students are black or Hispanic. That's what accounts for the poor standing of the United States in these international test score comparisons. And the bottom line is that what's wrong with American schools is not global. What's wrong with American schools is the achievement gap, period. And that, if you want to take on something that's worth doing, that is what the country should be addressing. This gives you an idea about the trends in PISA. I'll go through these very quickly. By race, ethnicity, and there is a kind of a discontinuity in the reading stuff that doesn't mean very much. But basically, if anything, the minority groups over time have been doing a bit better, even as the United States continues to lag internationally. And you can see, and actually, one of the things that does bear more scrutiny here is what's going on with us in math, although that didn't show up in the TIMSS in the lower grade levels. So what is driving this across time? What is likely to drive this in future? I've taken this time series, the percentage of 15-year-olds by race ethnicity from 1997 to 2030. And this is not much of a projection because if you accept the mortality, immigration, and the like, all of these kids who are going to be 15 in 2030 are already with us. And you can see that what's really driving population composition is the growth of the Hispanic population. And that's going to do us, unless there's some real change in achievement levels, that's not going to do us any good in these international comparisons. So, let's think about what accounts for the race-ethnic differentials. And for this, I had to go back one round of PISA. All of these studies are large repeated cross-section surveys. I had to go back to PISA 212. That's because in its wisdom, the National Center for Education Statistics has not yet released the 2015 microdata, which were promised last April, and I keep wondering what is going on in that agency. But anyway, in 2012 data, it's going to be pretty much the same. So I was able to control for socioeconomic status, nativity, family structure, grade level, and grade repetition, and in broad strokes, the black-white differential, these variables explain less than 30% of the black-white differential in achievement in any of the subjects. Actually, it was only around 20% in science and math and about 30% in reading. The Hispanic-white differentials are quite different. Reading, a lot of it, 70%, can be attributed to these very simple statistical controls, 40% in science and 50% in math. So where are we? The U.S. is mediocre in international achievement comparisons, mainly because the Hispanics and blacks score poorly, partly, but not entirely, because they're socially and economically disadvantaged, and also because Hispanics are increasing as a share of the youth population. So the question is, what's to be done? There are lots of claims out there about how to improve the academic achievement of minorities, and many of you may have had experience with one or more of these kinds of efforts. You've got no excuses charter schools, you've got one thing and another, and every now and then we read about some wonderful miracle, some silver bullet that has achieved great things. But my judgment is that none of these actually demonstrate success at scale, by which I mean covering a reasonably large population, sustained across time, and at every age or grade level. So the question is there such a case? Let me give you this scenario, and I'll read it. If someone asked you to describe expected achievement scores in a student population where many of the parents have high personal debt, with only a single parent at home, 40% is Latino or black, students can expect to change schools between 6 to 9 times as they move through primary and secondary school, what would you expect? Below average results, right? So let's see what happens in this particular case, because it isn't so. The school system that I'm going to talk about is run by an outfit called the DODEA, the Department of Defense Education Authority. There are upwards of 100,000 students in that system at any given time in the schools that are on base. What happens? Here are the trends in NAEP reading achievement in the 4th and 8th grades. The 8th grade is on the top, the 4th grade is in the bottom, comparing the DODEA schools with regular public schools in the United States. And what do you see? Not much trend in either case, perhaps a slight trend upward, but the DODEA schools are superior consistently over a period of decades, okay? Math achievement, the difference is not as great, but it's still there. These schools do very well in comparison with regular public schools. So, and here's where I need the pointer. Take a look at these bottom 2 rows. What they tell you at each grade level, grade 4 and grade 8, and in each of these 3 basic areas of study, the advantage of the DODEA schools relative to public schools for blacks on this side, whites on this side. Now, a standard deviation of these test scores is about 35. That says that the advantages of the DODEA schools range from about a quarter to half a standard deviation. Now, I've been involved in looking at evaluations of social programs, educational programs, welfare programs, whatever it is, for years. If you move a distribution up by, say, 1/10 of a standard deviation, there are parades. Okay, these effects are really, really huge. They don't get to be sure, the differentials there are still differentials, but they're much, much smaller. So you have this population of school kids who have high performance, where the differentials, the race ethnic differentials that plague us, are much, much reduced. So this is part of the problem. This is where the question begins, and I'm not going to read that stuff, but if you scan that list, you see there are all sorts of things that are really quite good, quite favorable about the DODEA schools. And the question on which I'm going to end is, we don't know what's really worked. Maybe it's the whole package. Maybe it's because there's a wraparound. Maybe because these kids are in a command and control system, whatever it is. But the achievement gains are there. And then keep in mind that this population is disadvantaged in some ways. There are frequent family disruptions, there are frequent moves, there is a problem of bullying that has been documented, there are inadequate services for disabled students in that population, and then you have to ask what kind of selection effects may occur into the military service. And that's a question I cannot answer either. But all in all, considering the pluses and minuses of this system, there is something really important there to be reckoned with. So the bottom line is that it's not clear what accounts for the success of the DODEA schools, but they are a model at scale of what all school systems should be working to accomplish, and we should try to find out which, or whether it's all, among their distinct characteristics and practices account for their extraordinary success. Thank you. And 2 minutes and 40 seconds left.
A few minutes for questions. And we're going to start in the balcony. Conrad.
Conrad Harper, New York City. Bob, thank you for that very challenging presentation, and it caused me to think a good deal. But I don't think I saw in your list of characteristics that may be relevant the whole issue of the racial agenda, the racial mix, the racial circumstances that obtain in the military as compared to civil society of this country. It seems to me highly likely that the degree to which the parents and the students have race as something that is not as disadvantageous in the military context as it is in our civil context bears materially on the degree to which the students feeling that kind of comfort, that kind of security can perform better.
I think you're absolutely right, because that the military has really become a model of how to either, either integrate or disregard race as a factor in social interaction and in social hierarchy. And that is critically important. And it's sort of subsumed, I won't try to excuse myself. One might say that it's sort of subsumed in the notion of command and control, because that's what the military does. But I absolutely agree with you that that's a very important aspect of what makes the military situation differ from that in civilian life.
Michael.
Michael Silverstein, Chicago. In my area of life, I notice a very, very strong differentiation between urban school systems and suburban school systems, which are funded in radically different ways, to radically different degrees, also have a different complexion, you might say, of the various categories of families and students that you are tracking in these studies. So I'm wondering whether, in fact, you've broken out the data which might show that the systematic and persistent disinvestment in public school systems has had an effect, as opposed to the sustained investment in suburban school systems, which also affects, needless to say, racial and ethnic differentials. differentiation?
I can respond in two ways. The first is that you're right, and you can't do it with these data. There's just no way to do it, given the way the sampling scheme is designed and the way the variables are collected, to the best of my knowledge. I would say, by way of criticism of what I've done, that there are lots of other things I wish I could have put into this. The other thing, though, that you have to keep in mind is that every school is heterogeneous. That was the big lesson that people didn't seem to get from the famous Coleman report of 1965, that perhaps 20 to 25% of the variance in kids' achievement was between schools. Most of the variation in achievement, every place, is among students within schools. And that's sort of the fundamental argument that is in favor of the kinds of controls that I was able to introduce in that analysis.
Howard.
Hi,
Howard.
Bob. You said something in passing which I wanted you to talk a bit more about. And you said you weren't going to count the 12th graders because they knew these tests don't count. So I guess I want to know whether kids who are younger think they count, and whether maybe in the military schools they count in a way that they don't elsewhere. When you said command and control, I don't know whether that was you're alluding to, but it's basically the motivational issue, which I'm sure is a bigger issue in the United States than, say, in China or
There was
Singapore.
very little, what should I say? There was very little literature about these schools, and so what I've done is to combine what amounts to some journalistic accounts of what goes on in those schools with the test score data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. But one of the things that came through loud and clear to me in the descriptive material was that testing doesn't have the same kind of importance in these schools that it does in other schools. They are not, for example, they were not subject to the testing rules of No Child Left Behind. And one of the items on the list here that I showed was that tests were used wisely, basically as diagnostic tools. So my guess would be that these kids are not under the same kind of pressure to do well in one test after another, as is often the case now in our regular public schools. But I could be wrong, but that was the impression that I was left with. Yeah.
Holly Smith, Ann Arbor. I wondered if the DODA data, if you might ever break out how long a child had been in those schools, because I would think families would come and go in the military.
That's a very good question, and I don't know. I had to rely on literally, well, it's virtually impossible to lay hands on NAEP microdata. And I didn't have any, and so what I've done is just breaking out from published findings or from spreadsheets that are in the back room somewhere at the National Center for Education Statistics. So I don't know if NAEP actually collects those kinds of data, and they would be very, very important to have some sense of, who's been moving and who hasn't been moving. I've been thinking about that a lot. Many of you may know the work that Matt Desmond did in his book Eviction, which won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction last year. He was to some degree one of my graduate advisees at Madison, and when I read about this pattern of repeated eviction among poor families in Milwaukee, I kept wondering and kept prodding Matt to tell me, to what degree are the problems that these kids have in education a function of those frequent moves? And he wasn't able to answer that question either, but I think it really is a very important one and would be good to know. On the other hand, in that military population, people are constantly being reassigned. So there is a great deal of movement, and maybe the kids get used to it. Maybe it's just not as traumatic as it is for some others. I don't know.
Okay, that has to be our last question. And thank you, Bob.